We start podcast 2 of chapter 2 with the theories on how people learn. These three theories are also related to teachers' teaching philosophies. A behaviorist teacher thinks that the external environment shapes behavior and therefore shapes learning. Rewarding good behavior and movement responses is what they think about. An example is using the peppermint candy to reward the Nation Ford students for getting balls into hula hoops. The behavioral theory is also associated with direct instruction teaching and strategies, in which they're more teacher-directed teaching strategies. The second theory is about information processing, which emphasizes the internal processing of the learner. It is associated with critical thinking and trying to a teacher using questioning techniques or inquiry technique. The last theory on how people learn is called the cognitive theory or constructivist theory. The focus is on how learners construct their own learning. It's a holistic perspective, again related to a teacher's philosophy. They look for main ideas, solving problems, creating and applying what they've learned. Many indirect teaching strategies are associated with this theory of learning, and that means that the teaching strategy is actually more student-centered instead of teaching-centered. Again, the behaviorist theory means that teachers should model good behavior, and content is usually broken down into small parts that students can handle successfully. They have chunks of information, but remember that they can only attend to 1 to 2 things at one time, or they'll get brain overload. The information processing theory of learning says that the knowledge of how learners process information helps teachers and coaches select appropriate cues and design appropriate feedback for learners. It is more interactive than a plain direct teaching centered type of approach or teaching strategy, but that type of teaching strategy is much more interactive. The cognitive or constructivist theory of learning is a more student-centered learning theory. It actually looks at the role of the learner in mediating instruction and constructing personal meaning from the learning experience. Many times the learner will already have prior experience in particular skills or games or physical activities before they come to this learning theory or teaching approach. There is a continuum from direct teaching instruction or teaching strategies to indirect instruction or teaching strategies. Direct teaching strategies include things like lecture or command style. It also includes stations, which is a little more student-centered but still being directed by teachers. Peer teaching, again being planned by teachers, and inquiry and questioning. The indirect instruction teaching strategies that we have in physical education are problem solving, guided discovery, and cooperative learning. Which theory of learning is better is entirely up to the teacher, or you as future teachers. Which ones do you think are more compatible to your personality and the way you think that students learn best? Are the theories of learning incompatible? No, they're not incompatible. They're very compatible because they're actually interrelated. They're very much related or similar to each other. Theories of learning are actually exhibited in your teaching strategies, but it's important to remember that there is rarely, if ever, one type of teaching strategy that you use for an entire lesson. Usually lessons have more than one teaching strategy involved. It's also important to remember that a teacher does not fit into one type of theory of learning only. Usually you take parts of different theories of learning, and that helps you form your philosophy toward teaching and how you teach. How people move is a complex system of movements or individual movements that are all brought together into one movement system. All movement responses that you see students do are constrained by 3 types of constraints: their maturational level or physical abilities, the environment, which means the weather conditions and the way the tasks are organized or the environment is organized. And then lastly, the task constraints, the rules of the game, the student's understanding of the task, the equipment and how you might adapt that equipment. Those are all important parts of how people learn movements. As mentioned in the first podcast, the environment can be manipulated by the teacher to elicit appropriate responses. A great example of this is the Teaching Games for Understanding curriculum model, where the teacher sets a task in a game, uh, in a game-like environment to bring out the skill. That game-like environment sometimes is what we call small-sided games or whatever, and playing a game is playing it as a whole in a more holistic way, but it elicits certain skills as they are and tactics as they are playing the game. Teaching games for understanding, or the tactical games approach, also many times has students working in grids, working on particular movement tasks and movement responses to try to elicit the correct response from the student. However, it's important to remember that motor learning constraints on skills do make a difference, and sometimes the environment can elicit inappropriate responses. For instance, trying to get young pre-K or kindergarten students to stand too close together while practicing the overhand throw. A mature overhand throwing pattern means that you have to step in opposition, and stepping in opposition makes someone throw the ball really far. So if they're standing close together, it will not elicit that type of response because the students won't step in opposition. Another example is using the two-hand backhand in tennis, which used to be thought of as being an inappropriate motor response. But now it might be good form because young students are not able to have the strength to use a racket on the backhand side without using a second hand. But it does mean that there's less reach for the students when they use a two-handed backhand. There are three stages of motor learning, the first of which is the cognitive phase, which is assisted by a teacher demonstration. It's the stage that students identify critical elements of the skill, practice the whole part whole, and reduce the critical elements to only the essentials. It is also where the students sequence the pattern of the skill and the pattern of the verbal cues. Cues such as swing through, racket back, shoulder turn, as we were using in tennis. The associative phase is when students use refinements to those skills, and the automatic phase is when the movement becomes more automatic. Performance is consistent and it can be adapted to conditions as well as applying the tactics of offensive and defensive strategies, and also aiming and target games. When the prerequisites of a skill are not defined or known by the teacher, we usually ask them to do a task analysis. In our case, I've asked you to do a mini unit plan that shows what the task analysis is of all of the critical elements of each of the skills in that sport or activity. The motivational or attentional dispositions are important because the motivation for doing the skill makes the skill more meaningful for the students. It helps them form what's called a motor program for the skill, or the executive plan for the skill, which emphasizes the highly cognitive aspect of skills. You've probably heard the saying, practice makes perfect. That's why we try to hit as many tennis balls as possible at Nation Forward to get the students to have more experience and more practice, because they will get better the more hits they have on the ball. And then finally, knowledge of results is one of the best ways to give feedback to students. Knowledge of results means that the student sees the result of the skill, hears the result of the skill, such as the sound of the ball on the tennis racket in the sweet spot and how good that sounds, or the feel of the movement. That provides them with feedback on whether they did the skill correctly or not. This is the end of podcast 2 for chapter 2. The next podcast is podcast 3.